Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we are continuing to look at my games from the Southwest Open 2021 and my fourth round game. Remember, I didn't have a first round game, so my fourth round game is actually my third game. Is against a strong expert, a young man by the name of Eric Liu. I think he was rated around 2120. I had the white pieces in this game, and this was the only game with the white pieces in the tournament that I failed to win. I began with d4. He played d4, c4, e6, knight c3, and he surprised me with bishop to e7. I had looked up some of his games on chess.com 30 minutes before the round, trying to figure out, what he played, and what I saw that he played was not what he ended up playing in the game, and which happens, of course. I myself give a false trail on chess.com before a tournament. I play a bunch of openings that I don't play in tournament chess, so if someone looks up my account, they'll see the wrong games. I probably shouldn't be telling you that, but that's what I do. So he plays bishop to e7 in the Queen's Gambit declined, and the idea here is to sort of neutralize the exchange variation a bit by not putting the knight on f6, not allowing the white bishop to go to g5. I went ahead and played the exchange variation. I knew very little about the theory after bishop to e7, to be honest, and it's pretty clear in the game. So cd5, ed5, so I played the bishop to f4, since I can't play it to g5. c6, e3, then he plays bishop to f5, which is a strong move. It puts the bishop that's often a hard piece to develop for black in a Queen's Gambit on a strong diagonal. Now, I had a vague notion in my head that if white wanted any chance of getting an advantage in this position, white would have to play the move g4 here. But I also knew it was sharp and that white had to play very precisely. And I really knew nothing about the theory of g4, I just knew it existed. So I made the decision to go ahead and play bishop to d3 to challenge and trade off that light-squared bishop. I also knew that once I did this, any real chance of an opening advantage would go out the window. The game would essentially be equal, and I would have to hope to outplay my opponent in that equal position. Bishop d3, queen d3. The bishops are off the board. Knight f6, knight f3, bishop to d6. I also had a notion here that white wants to preserve that dark-squared bishop when black challenges it on d6. Black wants to trade off both bishops. And so I played bishop to g5. Probably not the best move. Maybe bishop to e5 is a little bit better, but not bad. Bishop g5 is a perfectly good move. So bishop g5, knight bd7, castles. Now, the standard plan for white in this position is something called the minority attack. There's another plan for white where you play knight g to e2 and f3 and try to advance in the center, but I can't do that now. That's the whole idea behind the early bishop to e7 from black, to prevent that plan. But so I play rook a to b1. The idea is to advance that b pawn and create a weakness on c6, trade it off for the c6 pawn, and then when black recaptures, there's a weakness at c6, there's a weakness on the c5 square. So he plays a5 so that I can't play b4. The pawn would just be captured. Rook f to c1 to try to control that half-open c-file. Queen to e7 to help lend control to b4 to keep that advance from taking place, but also strengthening black in the center, maybe moving the queen up, playing the knight to e4. Queen c2, queen to e6, getting out of the pin and preparing to put some pressure on my king side. In this Carlsbad structure, you often play on the side of the board where your pawns point. My pawns point to the queen side, black's pawns point to the king side. That will be where he's trying to get most of his action. So I play knight to e2. The idea for me is I want to bring this bishop back to f4 and trade it off after trying to avoid the trade. Now I'm seeking the trade. An example of how really imprecise and poorly I've handled this position so far. I have not done well. It's a resilient structure, so I'm still okay, but I haven't played very well. Black plays the knight to e4, standard move, bishop f4. Now black plays f5 It's an aggressive move. He wants to expand on the king side and not only attack with pieces, attack with pawns as well. The only real downside of it is that it weakens that e5 square. So I may be able to get a knight there. Bishop d6, queen d6, knight f4. I want to take that knight on f4, move it to d3, and both of those knights, either one of them can jump into the e5 square. g5, aggressive play, kicking that knight, knight to d3, queen to h6, and here I play knight f to e5. On examining the game afterwards, it's clear that b4, going ahead with that move, which I can now play, is definitely the strongest idea, and I would be doing well after this move. Black's a little bit overextended on the king side. It's dangerous. I would have to be careful. But if a b4, rook takes b4, and if he were to, say, defend the b7 pawn with rook a to b8, I could just advance the a pawn and create weaknesses in his position, and I'd have a strong position in that case. During the game, I think I looked at it, and for some reason I didn't play it. Definitely a mistake. Knight f to e5, knight takes, and now the position is just equal. He plays g4, looking to expand on the king side. I played queen to e2. What I want to do is play f3 and kick that knight out. I can't do that right now because if I had played it before, queen takes e3 with check would be played. So I defend the e3 pawn so I can play f3 and kick my opponent's knight out. Plays king to g7. So now if I were to play f3, he would take, and this pawn g2 would be pinned by the queen. And I play king to h1 to get out of that situation. Queen to h6. Now if I played the pawn here, he would play knight to g3, forking the king and queen, and the h-pawn couldn't capture it because it would be pinned by the queen on h6. So queen to h6, again, preventing me from playing f3, back, and back. And we agreed to a draw via a threefold repetition. The only idea that worried me a little bit was if he had played h5 here, trying to strengthen that g4 pawn so he maybe could play f4 for the attack. But I'm really fine here, this g3. But at the end of the day, I would have been okay. So we agreed to a draw. I really went into this game not knowing exactly how to handle this structure. That's on me. I didn't play very precisely, but because of the nature of the position and the structure, neither one of us was ever in any real danger. My next game was against a master named Eric Kurtz, and in many ways, I made some of the best decisions in any game that I played in this tournament, in this game. You know, the way the tournament goes, you know, you'll usually play a couple of players that are lower rated, and then you'll finally get paired against people that are within your own rating range. Eric Kurtz was about 60 rating points or so above me. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's when you really need to win, is when you're finally playing your own level of opponent. That's the hardest game to win. When you're playing someone very highly rated, you feel like you're playing with house money. You're playing someone much lower. You say, well, I'm the better player, I should win. But when you're playing your own rating level, that's the real mirror. You're really looking in the mirror saying, how good a player am I? And this was a game like that. I had the black pieces. He began with c4, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2. He's playing the English opening. Knight c3, castles, d3. Early for that move. It's flexible. It leaves different possibilities for white, different ways of handling the structure. d6, e4. Now he's saying, I'm going to play the Botvinnik English. And this is a tough opening for black to deal with. The main reason is that white has 3 potential pawn breaks that they can use at any given time, and you have to always be ready for these pawn breaks. And white often has a very safe king. So you have to be at your best when playing this opening. c5, knight g to e2. He wants to control d4, but doesn't want black to be able to pin that knight with the bishop to g4. Knight c6, castles, a6. I want to play the rook to b8 and expand with b5. And he plays a3. Not the most common move. The most common move here is a4 to keep me from playing b5. But he plays a3, and basically he's going to mirror me. He's going to do the same thing I'm doing. I'll expand with b5. He wants to expand with b4. And in my experience, this is actually a more effective way of playing than a4 is. I find this to be quite a challenging approach to this opening. Rook b8, rook b1, b5, cb5, ab5, then b4. Then he does what I did. I played the bishop to g4, pinning the knight temporarily. I'm just trying to get him to play f3 to block his own bishop, which he does. Bishop goes back to e6. Then bishop to e3. Takes, and d5. And I've equalized in the opening. I've done fairly well so far. So I can feel good about the way I've played. Bishop f4. And here I played rook to a8 because the bishop is attacking the rook. So I play the rook to the open file, which makes sense. However, a more efficient way of playing would have been to play queen to b6 check, king h1, and then have moved that rook to d8 to support the d5 pawn, because I end up putting a rook there anyway, and this would have done in 2 moves what it ended up taking me 3 moves to execute in the game. Rook a8, d4, queen to b6. I was really worried about de4, fe4. I didn't want to open up this bishop on g2, but as it turns out, that probably was the better option, and I could just drop the bishop into c4. I would have been doing okay, but I feel okay about the decision I made. King to h1, rook f to d8. He plays e5, knight e8, queen to d2. So white has a lot of space. I have to challenge his central space advantage immediately. I really have no choice, so I'll just get completely suffocated. So I play f6. He takes, I take with a pawn. Then g4, controlling the f5 square and potentially expanding on the king side. And this is the moment where I came up with what I thought was my best strategic concept of the entire tournament. White has this weak c4 square, so I thought to myself, what's the best piece to land on that square? And I came to the conclusion that the rook at a8 was actually the best piece. And I went about placing that rook on the square. Now, maybe I was wrong, but it ended up leading to a pretty decent position, and the computers don't think it's a bad idea at all. So I was very proud of this concept. I think it was a very good idea. Rook a to c8, queen to d3, knight to a7 to clear the way for the rook and defend b5. Bishop to e3, rook to c4. So here this rook sits. It's putting a lot of pressure on the file. It's also hitting these 2 pawns, and it's a well-placed piece. Knight goes to f4, bishop f7, queen to d2, knight c7. The knight defends these 2 pawns from that square. Knight to d3, knight to c6, knight to c5. And I've done a pretty good job so far in the game, in what is really a challenging opening to play against. But here I begin to lose my way. I have many opportunities from this point forward to capture either this pawn at b4 or this pawn at d4, and I decide not to do it. I'm just a little timid about it. I'm afraid of opening up the position prematurely, but that was a mistake. Even here, I should have gone ahead and grabbed the pawn at b4, and it was a mistake not to do it. And I begin to lose my way, lose the thread of the game here. f5. This is a mistake. It opens up my king a little bit too much. Obviously, I'm trying to open up this bishop to the d4 square, but it makes my king a little too vulnerable. Knight to e2, defending d4. Knight to e6, attacking it a second time. And he plays gf5. And I debated between 2 moves. The first move I was looking at was knight e d4, going ahead and grabbing the d4 pawn. This is the move I should have made. After this move, I'm doing quite well, I think. It's still, relatively balanced, but I think I have a little bit better position in this case. It would involve allowing him to recapture on g6 with a pawn. So I decided to not do that, and I played gf5. And after this, I'm just in trouble, if not losing. He's able to get rid of those dark squared bishops, and that sort of sinks me. Bishop to h6 immediately. He goes after that bishop. More accurate move actually would probably be knight takes e6, bishop e6, rook to g1, king h8, bishop f1. And then he can actually give up the exchange here, check. And if I were to play the king back to h8, not the best move, but the one that clearly shows the problem with my position, queen g5, he's coming into f6, and I would be in big trouble. But he plays bishop to h6 immediately. I do not want to trade those dark squared bishops off. If they come off, I'm toast. I have would have too many weaknesses around my king. The bishop goes to f6, and again, I should have grabbed this central pawn. I failed to do this repeatedly. King d7, knight d4, queen g5, king h8, and this is very much a playable position for black. And once again, I'll have to look in the mirror and why didn't I grab one of those central pawns? What was I afraid of? Because it really ended up costing me dearly. Rook to g1, king to h8, and now the game is over. I can still take the pawn. I don't know why I didn't. King to h8. Now knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and bishop g5. And I decided to give up the exchange, which is as good as anything here. I just can't lose those dark squared bishops. So I play the bishop back to g7, bishop takes d8, queen takes d8, rook g to c1. He wants to trade off that rook as quickly as possible. Queen to b6, rook c4, bc4, b5, advancing the passed pawn and hitting my knight. Knight to a5, rook to a1, forcing the knight to move because the queen and the rook attack it. Knight to b3, rook to a8, check. Bishop g8 is forced. Queen to e3 is threatening to come into the e8 square and hit that bishop at g8. Also, he could play, depending on where my queen goes, the queen to the e6 square and hit it that way. Knight takes d4, knight takes knight, and here f4 probably would have been the stronger move, and now this bishop could have taken this pawn, and along with this rook piled up on g8. Knight takes, queen takes, bishop takes. Now he plays f4, king g7, rook to d8. And here I made an error. I've actually fought pretty hard here, and I can make this a more competitive endgame. I'm still losing no matter what I do here. What I should have played in this position was bishop to b6, king d7, king f8, rook d6, bishop c7, bishop f4. And this is still not good for me, but it's competitive. I'm really making white work, and he could still make a mistake. This was the first of two mistakes in the endgame I made in this tournament, where I could have kept things much more competitive than I did. I went and played c3, but I already saw the variation and knew that this was losing. Bishop takes, rook takes, c2, then rook to d7, check, winning a tempo so that he could then play the rook behind the passed pawn, and the game is completely over, and I resigned. So my first loss of this tournament, this was definitely the most disappointing because it was someone of a similar rating, and because I made some really good decisions and played some really strong chess for most of this game, but not for all of it. And if you want to win at the tournament level in a serious game, you have to win in all phases, and you have to play a good game in every phase. So lesson learned, and I have to work on some of the mistakes I made, particularly not grabbing those central pawns when I had the chance. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog, and the next video we'll be finishing up this tournament, and look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.